Hello, welcome to 30 Minutes. I'm Rick Anthony. Anyone who's paying even a little attention to what's going on in the world today would agree that it's difficult to select the number one most horrific event on the globe. Regrettably, there are too many examples of man's inhumanity to man. Certainly one of the worst examples was the subject of a recent two-day conference of subject experts at Villanova University. One after one, the speakers addressed in compelling detail the plight of religious minorities in the Middle East who live under the ever-present specter of threats and atrocities committed by Islamic State terrorists and jihadists. Titled Christians in the Contemporary Middle East, the conference examined the policies and tools that could work in the region and how to implement them to save the lives of millions of innocent people. My guest today is the organizer of the conference, Father Kail C. Ellis, OSA, PhD, currently Special Assistant to the President of the University and Dean Emeritus of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Father Ellis has made more than 25 trips to the Middle East. He is of Lebanese ancestry, as am I. He was recently awarded the Ellis Island Medal of Honor, sponsored by the National Ethics Coalition of Organizations, awarded to distinguished American citizens who exemplify a life dedicated to community service. Father Ellis, welcome to 30 Minutes.
Thank you very much, Rick.
I attended the conference. I have been looking forward to this visit because the subject is so important, and we're all reminded of it every single day in the horrific headlines of what's going on in the Middle East. First question, though, is, in your opinion, why is the massacre of innocent people and the genocide of tens of thousands of people simply because of their religion? Why is that underreported or not reported at all in the news media?
Well, I tend to disagree a little bit because I think it has been reported. And a number of newspapers and journals and
Yes.
even contemporary journals here in this country, such as Newsweek and think tank reports such as the Center for American Progress, etc. So one of the impetuses for this conference was a reaction to what happened in 2014 in Iraq with the capture by ISIS of Mosul, and also of the fighting and dispossession of Christians in what is called the Nineveh Plain in Iraq. These are the villages, primarily Christian villages surrounding the city of Mosul, which was a city of about 1.2 million people, of which it had a substantial, long-standing Christian population. And a lot of the headlines, number of the headlines, talked about, is this the end of Christianity in the Middle East? What should the Iraqi Christians do, et cetera, et cetera. So I was quite taken by that, particularly what was reported when ISIS took over the city. They immediately went to Christian houses and daubed on there the Arabic letter Nun, which is in English N, which stands for Christian, which is the Arabic word for Christian is Nasara, from obviously the town where Jesus came from, which is Nazareth. So Christians were called in that area basically Nazarenes or Nasara. So I think it has been well reported. I think what has not been reported is about the status of Christians in that region and their longstanding history and their whole relationship with Muslims, which has been throughout the centuries. When Islam first came in the 6th century, has been one of a shared heritage, and Christians up until the 11th and 12th century, really constituted the majority population in that region until the whole region became almost thoroughly Islamicized. So one of the basic concepts of the conference was to talk about that history of Christianity, how it was there right from the beginning of Christianity, and the remnants of that community which are still there today.
Maybe the problem then is that based on the coverage we see, not only of those atrocities, but all the other mayhem that's going on in the region, we've just become numb to it. It's lost its significance.
Well, we are certainly, we are in crisis overload.
Yes.
And, today, before it was Yazidis who are in Iraqi ancient community, and now, of course, we talk about the Rohingya in Myanmar, and and the dispossession of about 500,000 of them going into Sri Lanka, whatever. So, yeah, I mean, we're constantly bombarded, if you will, with crisis fatigue, if you will. But nevertheless, I think the Middle East, and particularly the status of Christians in that region, is kind of indicative of where that region itself is going, and what the future would hold for that region in terms of diversity. Because the whole, contrary to a popular perception, the popular perception is that that region is monolithic. It is not monolithic. It is diverse. It is diverse in terms of religion. It is diverse in terms of ethnicity, and it is diverse, obviously, in terms of politics. No one country is the same. So what would be lost with the loss of Christianity in that region is certainly its diversity, but also I think there's not a very good realization of what the Christians contributed to Islamic civilization throughout those first 10, 11 centuries, not only before Islam but after Islam, and the whole history behind philosophy and literature and all these other all of these other considerations that go to a shared culture. That, to me, has been well articulated, as well as not appreciated. Christianity, even some Muslims think Christianity was a Western import. Like, for example, was a virus that was brought in by the Crusaders, and obviously that is not the case. But even in terms of Western Christians, somehow we look at the Acts of the Apostles, and this is one of the speakers brought out this point. Sidney Griffith from Catholic University, he's a priest at Catholic University. He brought out that we talk about Paul and the other apostles going westward, but we never somehow that other concomitant spreading of Christianity to the east was never mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. Probably. We're not sure exactly why, but somehow it became somewhat subsidiary, because people don't realize that Christianity also spread not only to the Arabian Peninsula, where it had a large influence upon on Muhammad and the formation of Islam, but also to India and to China and up into Mongolia. So that and there are remnants of these communities there, but they have basically all but disappeared. But so we don't have that historical appreciation of the spread of Christianity.
Two things as I'm listening to what you're saying. One, maybe part of the problem from our standpoint, the West standpoint, is we're now confronted with language and symbols that are foreign to us. Not literally foreign to us, but we just don't understand them. If I would submit that if you were to ask 10 people the difference between a Shiite and a Sunni, they wouldn't know what you were talking about, because they don't know what those two things are anyway. And that is, I think, puts us at a disadvantage, the general population, at least those who are paying attention, to what's really going on over there and the significance. The other thing you mentioned was the richness and the diversity of the region, not only in terms of religion, but in so many other ways as well. Isn't that part of the problem in trying to bring them together?
Well, exactly. You see that today in Iraq.
To come up with some kind of peaceful solution.
Exactly. You see that in terms of the whole ethnic Kurds, for example, who happen to be Sunni Muslims, but are looking for independence from Iraq, the northern Kurdistan. But that threatens the other countries in the region that also have substantial Kurdish populations, such as Turkey primarily, but also Syria, but also Iran. So, this goes into the whole mix of the instability of the region.
Yes, and for us, in terms of our foreign policy, puts us in a very awkward situation where we're playing this game of the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yes, it is.
With the Kurds in particular.
Right, but I think there was also a lack of historical understanding of the region. For example, when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, there was no understanding, even among policymakers. They did not know the difference, as you brought up, between Sunni and Shia. And realizing that was a split within Islam that took place from the early part of it, basically as a controversy over who was going to succeed or be the successor to the Prophet Muhammad. So what we lack is basic understanding of the region. And that basic understanding is not only extends to the earliest part of the formation of Islam within that region, but also in terms of even, into the 20th century, when the Western powers after World War I divided up that region and imposed, in a sense, artificial borders. The Kurds expected to have a state. They were disappointed. Why were they disappointed? Because there were oil interests. And that was primarily with regard to Iraq. And so, but also in terms of what happened in Syria, what happened in Lebanon, these were the colonial powers. They called them mandates after World War I, but they were really colonial powers, spheres of influence that were imposed after the Treaty of Versailles. So that whole history of colonialism has given rise, in a sense, to our concept of Christians, in particular, minorities. And the fact is, Christians do not regard themselves as a minority in the Middle East. They don't. They regard themselves as citizens, and albeit sometimes undergoing persecution or discrimination or those types of things. But nevertheless, I think we don't realize, and this is one of the things that the conference strove to point out, is that the concept of minority is really a 19th century concept that has produced. Now, granted, it may have had origins within the whole Turkish Ottoman Empire situation where they formed millets, which were religious communities, but that was basically a vehicle in order for the Ottomans to govern. So by dividing up, say, the Orthodox and the Christians and the Jews and others into these millet systems, where they were allowed to keep their own language, they were allowed the head of the religious community was in charge of the community itself. And they were able to keep their personal laws such as inheritance and marriage laws and those types of things. So that was a factor, but it was somehow developed, particularly in the 19th century, into different communities, and therefore it was contrary to the Ottoman idea that the only difference between citizens was Muslims and non-Muslims, not necessarily Christians. And non-Muslims were, in a sense, protected. In other words, they were under the protection of the state. They were called Ahl-Dhimmi, which means the protected peoples of the book being primarily the Bible. And eventually this was extended to other religions as well. But it was a way of governing. So we have carried on that concept, and today we talk about minorities. In one sense, the idea of minorities here, even in the concept, is kind of a inaccurate description of how the Christians and other communities regard themselves, because they think themselves as really citizens and not necessarily
minorities. In this instance, also includes the Jews.
Oh yeah, yes,
very much so.
Yeah,
who were being persecuted.
Right, they did. And the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims, in the heyday, the golden age of Islam, particularly in the 7th through the 11th century in Baghdad, and then it moved to Cairo, with these centers of learning. The Jews are very much involved in that as well. So it was only later that Islam, Muslims became the majority, but in relative terms, because up until really the 19th century, the Christians, were not persecuted as such. Christians left the Middle East, particularly because they were able to do so. So the real threat today to Christianity, even though we hear a lot, and it should not be discounted about persecution, the real threat to Christians in that region is immigration. Immigration for social and political reasons, economic reasons. My father immigrated because of economic reasons, not because of persecution. People from Lebanon did that. People from Palestine, Christians, did that as well. Why was that? Because they had certain advantages over the Muslim population in that they had missionary schools that educated them. They had contacts with the West. Individuals from one of the villages would come and to the States, for example, or other countries, maybe Africa, whatever. They would leave and bring other people to them. So that's how it really works. So, but I know it's kind of a counterintuitive issue given all that we hear about
Yes.
persecution, but the major threat is the social economic conditions in those countries with authoritarian regimes that are inhibiting full equality of citizenship, and that these regimes, in a very cynical way, are exploiting religion, the religion of the majority, in order, not because those regimes are themselves religious, but because that's the way they can control people. And that has another whole layer effect upon the future of those countries. And that's what we're suffering
Take
today.
one microcosm, take Lebanon, and you're very familiar with what's going on over there. Lebanon at one point was predominantly Christian. Is that correct? Maronite.
Well, the formation of Lebanon goes back to 1920. Now, there was a part of Lebanon which is called Mount Lebanon, which was primarily Christian. The French wanted to incorporate other non-Christian parts into Lebanon in order to make it, quote unquote, economically viable. Now, for a while, Christians were 50% of the population. Not predominantly, just about 50%. But it was always very tenuous because they never took a census. The last census that was taken in Lebanon was 1932. And those other census has been taken since that time because they don't want to accept the confessional balance. But now it's estimated that Christians maybe constitute maybe 35, 40% of the population. The other percentage, I mean, is probably the rest of it is divided between Sunnis and Shia. So these are the three major religious confessional groups. But Lebanon is kind of unique in that Christians do have certain governmental prerogatives that other countries do not.
Still?
Still. For example, half the parliament is Christian. That's by design. So everything, I mean, the Christians not only constitute Maronites, but also Orthodox, also Armenians also have citizenship in Lebanon after World War I. And then you have the Sunni, and then you have the Shiite. And then you have the Druze, who identify, they're not really Muslims, but they identify under
Is
Islam.
the current president of Lebanon
The current president
Muslim?
no. The presidency is, after the Civil War in 1990, when that was settled, they decided to have three presidents. One president of the republic who is to be a Maronite. That's always by custom. It's all by custom. It's not written anyplace. And then the president of the parliament, who's always a Shiite. And then the president of the government ministers, who's always a Sunni. And that has continued. It's kind of like rarefied not rarefied, but made it solidified actually confessionalism, which is not really an ideal situation. But in order to satisfy these confessional groups, it is expedient to do that, at least currently, until secularization comes in.
It sounds like in corporate world, office of the president,
Right.
which doesn't work very often.
Right, but the president is kind of like the head of state. The president will go and represent.
No, I don't mean I mean in a corporate sense, not necessarily government.
So you'll have to acquaint me with that.
I should point out that it's shown on this brochure, but I'm wearing a lapel pin, that symbol that was, well, a lapel pin that was created for the conference, but the symbol was not created for the conference, right? So what's the history of the symbol?
The symbol was created for a Center for Arab and Islamic Studies, which was established at Villanova in 1983.
By you?
Yes, and I also had other people as well.
Of course,
I would not have been able to do it by myself if I did not have the cooperation of the dean and others. But it was a program that after the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the whole turmoil in the region that created, and it's imperative. It was imperative that, I mean, there are a lot of universities that have Middle Eastern studies, but there was one university, Georgetown, that had a center for contemporary Arab studies, and I was familiar with that program, and I thought that this was something that Villanova should have. It would be a unique contribution, and so, but none of them ever had Arab in the title, except for Villanova and for Georgetown, which created some problems politically in this region. Nevertheless, it was important to study, I mean, to have Arabic and for students to understand it, so we established Arabic as a language. As part of it, we didn't have had a Middle East historian, so we had to hire in that area. And we had to the whole economics of the MENA region, which is Middle East North African. We wanted to have somebody from economics to do that, and economic development, all these issues that we're very concerned about, educating students, to go on to graduate programs and this type of thing. And it was it had been a very successful program.
Is it open to anyone to come to the meetings, or is it intended only for...
Oh, you're talking about the meeting. I was talking about the academic program, but certainly the meetings, they have a number of conferences that have been established, yes. And as this one was, as you know.
Do they have monthly meetings, though?
Monthly events, you mean, in terms of meetings?
Well, the center. It is a center.
The center meets, but primarily it deals with what was programs and that type of thing. But it's not necessarily things that are open to people. It's just the faculty and who are involved with it.
Given the turmoil, given the history, given the failed attempts in the past, and based on what we see now, the failed attempts of the future, is there any reason for optimism, particularly coming out of the conference where most of the speakers, the 12 speakers you had, the themes seem to be, this is beyond anything we've been able to do in the past, and given the current political, social, security situations in that region, a solution is not in sight.
Well, the question is, what solution are we talking about here? If it's a military solution, that has not worked, and there is no military solution. What the conference pointed out, and what the volume that is going to be published, hopefully, very soon, from the conference pointed out, is that there is fundamental, basic issues that need to be addressed, and it's not democracy as such, and all. We're not going to impose democracy, but when you have a situation where, take Egypt for example, where about 60% of the young people don't have jobs and they go into the informal sector. And as one of the conference speakers pointed out, what are they faced with? They're faced with washing car windows, yes. or waiting on tables, or washing dishes in a restaurant. They have no future ahead of them because they have no security, no Social Security, the wages are low, therefore they can't get married because they can't afford to. This creates the fundamental turmoil, not only in Egypt, but in other countries of this, because of authoritarian regimes, that creates the instability which gives rise to radical jihadist groups. And so people, when they are desperate, turn to religion.
Sure.
And somehow religion is they used to have this phrase, Islam is the answer. Or even among the Copts, there is a resurgence of Christianity among Coptic Christians. And also the monasteries are overflowing with new recruits, young men going to the monasteries. Because
why the Coptics?
Why there?
Why that particular...
Well, we're talking about the situation in Egypt because sometimes it's a mirror reflection of what the majority population is also doing.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
But also because it's a desire to assert their own identity. And we talk a lot about identity politics nowadays, but it is very key. It is very key that that people want to maintain their heritage. And so therefore, for example, Copts, they said, we're the original people. You people here, you Muslims, are our guests. In a sense, because we were here before you, right? Now, of course, that says nothing about that the Copts were converted, eventually over the course of centuries to Islam. But nevertheless, in order to show their sense of belonging, I think a lot of that has to do with the resurgence of Coptic Christianity among the people with it. And of course, that's also, I'm sorry, I don't interrupt you.
No, that's okay.
But that's also in terms of the violence that has been perpetrated on the Coptic community. Where they tried to kill the patriarch back in the Holy Thursday, Palm Sunday, in his cathedral in Alexandria. So there's that factor as well, and but also there are fundamental legal issues. Now we talk about persecution in law, for example, blasphemy laws that have been put in, and how they have been interpreted, not to insult a religion. But then you find out that people will be able to go and denounce a neighbor and say they ripped up the Quran. And then, that creates, for political or for other reasons, Or there's also and not only the blasphemy laws, but there's also the restriction upon building of churches and repairing of churches. That's also in law. It has to go. They have to get permission from the government to do that, and sometimes it's delayed and all that. And so the illegal churches will appear because people want to have a place to worship, and that creates other conflicts within the Upper Egypt, particularly in cities like Minya and those other places in Upper Egypt where they have Coptic people.
Aren't you now making the point that this is a problem that is insoluble?
No,
because there are conflicting interests.
No, if you give in to that feeling that it's insoluble, then there's no hope.
Well, we can't hope for an economic solution because of the political situation and the oppression, political oppression and military oppression in the region. So how do we get to an economic solution? Just throwing money at it isn't going to do it.
No, you don't throw money at it because we do. I mean, look at all the billions of dollars we spent on military.
Yes, exactly.
On the military.
Yep.
So there's no shortage of money in that regard. However, there seems to be a shortage of money for economic development and those other issues, and I think that's where that's where the rub is. That our policy somehow. Before it was Soviet Union and communism, and now it's jihadist, and then it's Iran, and then there's always some other issue, but it's really a peripheral issue to the fundamental issue of economic development, and also social equality, human rights, and
you have a much better handle on history and cycles and so on. Are we now in a period of disintegration in the region, and obviously beyond that region? But eventually we'll find our way back to a period of relative equilibrium, integration. Well, whether it be some form of détente among these conflicting interests.
If you say we'll find our way back, it sounds like it's serendipitous. I think it has to be worked for.
That's what I was asking, whether it's serendipitous. Just follow the natural flow.
It has to be worked for. And I think that, not to get into the whole political thing, but for example, this seemingly desire to do away with the nuclear agreement with Iran, I think to me that would be disastrous for the whole region, because that reverts back to this whole idea of conflict. It feeds into the whole Sunni-Shia, conflict that people wanted to put in, want to use as a shorthand, basically, to explain the chaos, and that is not the fundamental reason for the chaos in the region, Sunni-Shia conflict. The fundamental reason is security, but also in terms of lack of economic development and prosperity for the region.
Father, what good is the agreement? It's not worth the paper it's written on if they're violating the agreement every single day.
Who says they are? The people the Congress has asserted it.
We see missiles going up that weren't supposed to exist. We have evidence, we have reports of the continuing development of their nuclear capability.
I don't think that's true, Greg. I think what it has been
What's
certified,
not true? The reports that...
No, I think what you're saying is what they are doing is to violate
the agreement.
The agreement is being upheld. It may be that they are also doing other things, such as doing some experimentation with regard to, or testing with regard to missiles. That was not part of the agreement. Maybe that should be part of the agreement, but that's a separate negotiation. So I mean, they have been certified. They were certified by I don't know how many hundreds of countries. Not hundreds of countries, but certainly all the European. And but the efforts that seem to be in place in this country, particularly by the president, is to undermine that, and I think that would be a disaster. You got to build on what we have, not rather just do away with it and say have that confrontation.
We've tried it with North Korea for a long time.
I'm not dealing with North Korea.
Okay. The conference, let's go back to the conference for a moment. Did it accomplish what you had hoped for?
Actually, it accomplished more than I had hoped for.
How so?
Because I'll be very frank. When I went into the conference, I wanted to discuss the history of Christianity, its contributions to the region, its contributions to the language, to the culture, that type of thing. But then, as I got into it more, and I began to try to put all these papers together and try to understand the basic issue, the concept of minority, I'll confess, I had no appreciation for that concept. I learned that as a result of the conference, and that as a Christian Maronite origin myself,
yes,
I've never heard anybody, I began to reflect on that. I've never heard anybody in Lebanon say, we're minorities. Have you?
No.
Okay. Matter of fact, the opposite occurs. We're the ones who form.
Exactly. I've taken pride in my Maronite heritage.
Right. And the same thing with regard to the Copts in Egypt. So, we were here. We developed a civilization here. We worked with the Muslims. We're not in opposition to Muslims. We want to continue to work with them and all that. But there are some radical groups in there that tend to blame communities. I mean, we see it happen in this country. The whole Black Lives Matter thing and the whole bit. It's a human problem, not necessarily a Middle Eastern problem.
Yeah.
I see the big sign out here by the church.
I know the stories that I've heard from my relatives who have been to Lebanon.
Right.
And you can double, triple them, quadruple them. But the stories would come back when they visited the villages.
Yes.
Where during the day and during the evening when they got together and celebrated, it was Muslim families, Christian families. They were doing business together. They were breaking bread together. They were intermarriage. They got along just fine.
They would visit,
until the government got involved.
Well, I'm not sure.
The
I'm not
politics.
sure about the government.
I meant the politics, not necessarily the government.
Yeah. Well, Lebanon is a rather unique situation because of the civil war that took place, which is a very complicated. I mean, that'd be another topic, but the whole Palestinian issue and that type of thing. But when they divided up into community, Christians versus Muslims, although there were sects on both sides, there were Christians on the so-called left and right and all that. They had these various. So that was unique. And then of course with the settlement that took place, the Christians said, well, we lost, and we're not getting the jobs. And I mean, this is the whole thing that occurs. But the Copts are complaining about that they're not rising to top positions because of their religion. That's where the human rights comes in. That's where the pressure on the government to have more equality. I mean, you had one question there about what's the Vatican doing about all this.
Yeah, I wanted to get to that.
Okay, shall I jump into that?
If we have time. Do we have time? We're out of time.
Okay, all right,
another time. But this has been fine. This has been great. I have a better understanding, I think a better appreciation of some of the issues. I still can't sort it all out.
Of course not. I mean,
to be optimistic that we're going to see any real relief, at least in whatever's left of my lifetime.
Well, I'm not saying that there will be either. I'm just saying that you have to work toward it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
We'll have you back.
Thanks very much.
As I just said, I think I understand less than I did before because it is so complex, so complicated, maybe beyond our powers. At any rate, this has been the 30 Minutes with Father Ellis from Villanova University on the topic of religious minorities and the struggle for secular nationalism and citizenship in the Middle East. Until next time, take very good care of yourselves.